There are mornings in Windsor that feel like the world is holding its breath. You know the kind. The air is still. The birds haven't started yet. The mist sits low on the grass like it doesn't want to move, and everything is so quiet you can hear your own heartbeat. That was the kind of morning it was. I wasn't supposed to be there, honestly. I'd come down from London the evening before. My cousin Sarah lives in a little flat above a bakery near Windsor town centre, and I'd promised her weeks ago I'd visit. We'd had tea, stayed up too late talking about nothing important, and I'd slept on her spare bed with a window that wouldn't close properly and let in the smell of early morning bread. By 6 in the morning I was awake, couldn't sleep. That half-open window had seen to that. So I did what I always do when I can't sleep somewhere unfamiliar. I put my coat on over my pajamas, pulled on the boots I'd left by the door, and went for a walk. Windsor in early October is something else. I don't know how to describe it except to say it feels like the whole town exists slightly outside of time. The castle is up on the hill, stone the color of old bone, and the long walk stretches out below it like something from a painting. At that hour, with the mist still clinging to everything, you half expect to see someone in a crinoline skirt walking a greyhound. I walked down through town, crossed the road, and started along the path that runs near Home Park. I wasn't heading anywhere specific, just walking, hands in my pockets, thinking about nothing and everything at the same time the way you do when you're tired but your brain won't switch off. I'd been walking maybe 20 minutes when I noticed the figure. He was standing near the edge of the tree line just off the path, not moving, completely still. At first I thought it was one of those decorative lamp posts, you know, the old black iron ones, but then I realized the shape was wrong, too tall in one place, and there was something red. Scarlet actually, deep dark scarlet that looked almost burgundy in the early light. A royal guard. Now I've seen guards before. Obviously, I'm from England. I've done the tourist walk past Buckingham Palace. I've watched the changing of the guard as a kid. I've rolled my eyes at American tourists trying to make them laugh. You think after all that you know what a royal guard looks like. But seeing one alone in the mist near the trees, before the world has woken up, that's a completely different thing. There was something about the stillness of him that made me slow my pace without even deciding to. Like my body understood something before my brain caught up. He was facing the path toward Adelaide Cottage. I knew vaguely what Adelaide Cottage was. I'd heard about it when the news broke a couple of years ago that the Prince and Princess of Wales had moved there. It was their quieter home, more private, away from the formality of Windsor Castle itself. A working family's home, people said, which always struck me as both charming and slightly surreal given who the family was. I kept walking slowly because I didn't want to seem like I was lurking. There's something about the presence of a royal guard that makes perfectly ordinary behavior feel suspicious. I've never understood it. You're just walking. You're a normal person walking on a path. And yet something about that uniform, that absolute refusal to move, makes you feel like you need to justify your existence. I nodded at him as I passed. He didn't react. Of course he didn't. That's the whole point. But I slowed again about 30 feet past him and turned slightly, pretending to look at the tree line, which was genuinely beautiful in the mist, and I just watched for a moment. He was young, or at least he looked young from the side. Couldn't have been more than mid-20s. His bearskin hat sat perfectly level. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed on something I couldn't see from my angle, which appeared to be the path leading toward the cottage. And then I heard it. A car. Not just any car sound. That specific sound. The kind that carries authority in the engine note. Low, smooth, unhurried, but purposeful. The kind of sound you only really get from a very expensive vehicle being driven by someone who is very good at their job. I turned fully. Coming down the lane, the private lane, the one with the low wooden posts that subtly tell you it's not really public access, was a dark car. Long, black, windows tinted to the point of opacity. And behind it, another one. My stomach did something I can only describe as a small flip. Because you don't see two cars like that moving together at 6:15 in the morning in Windsor, unless it means something. The guard shifted, just slightly, his chin lifted by maybe a centimeter. His shoulders, which I hadn't even realized were slightly adjusted, somehow became more squared. He took one step to the side, deliberate, measured, positioning himself so that he was fully visible from the lane. I stepped off the path and stood on the grass, because suddenly standing on the path felt wrong, like being in a road when a procession is coming. The first car slowed as it turned into the lane, then it stopped. Not parked, stopped, in the middle of the lane. The guard took 3 steps forward. That was all, 3 steps. But the way he moved, the precision of it, made those 3 steps feel significant, like something was happening. And something was. The front window of the lead car came down. Not the back, the front. The passenger side. And someone inside leaned out slightly and said something to the guard. I was too far away to hear the words. The mist dampens sound in that particular way it has, makes everything feel muffled and close and distant at the same time. I could hear the tone, low, matter-of-fact, but not the actual words. The guard's response was immediate. He turned back toward the cottage, reached up, and I thought for a moment he was adjusting his hat, but no, he was speaking, into something at his collar. A radio, he was radioing someone. I stood very still on the grass. I was aware, suddenly, of how odd I must look. A woman in a coat over pajamas standing on the grass in the mist staring at a royal guard and a blacked-out car. I probably looked like exactly the sort of person you'd radio someone about. But no one looked at me. Because whatever was happening was not about me at all. The guard turned back to the car, and this time he walked to it, right up to the passenger window, bent slightly so his face was level with the opening. There was an exchange, brief, no gestures, just words and then a nod from the guard. And then something I genuinely did not expect. He walked to the rear door of the car, stood beside it, and knocked. 2 knocks, quiet, respectful, but firm. The way you knock on a door when you have something important to say and you know the person on the other side needs to hear it. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the window came down, not the door, just the window, a few inches. I couldn't see who was inside. The angle was wrong, the mist was wrong, everything was wrong for actually seeing anything clearly. But I could see the guard. I could see his face from the side. And whatever he was saying it carefully, with something that looked from a distance like genuine deference. He was explaining something. The window stayed down for about 30 seconds, then it went back up. The guard straightened, took 2 steps back, and the car didn't move. It just sat there. I checked my watch, an old habit, I always wear one. Can't stand relying on phones, and it was 6:18. The car sat there for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the second hand go around. 4 minutes of nothing. The car's just there in the lane, the guard standing beside the path, the mist drifting, a wood pigeon somewhere in the trees starting up its repetitive, mournful call. And I stood on the grass and watched, and understood that something was being decided. Something about whether those cars would go forward or turn around. I need to tell you something about Adelaide Cottage before I go further, because it matters to what happened next. It's not a grand place. That's the thing people always seem surprised by. When they say the Prince and Princess of Wales moved there, people picture something enormous, something ornate. But Adelaide cottage is actually the right word. Modest by royal standards. A few bedrooms, a garden, trees all around it. The kind of place that, if you didn't know, you might walk past and think belonged to a very comfortable country solicitor. The point of it, as far as anyone knew, was that it gave the family something closer to a normal life. or as close as that was ever going to be possible. Which means that whoever was inside that black car, whoever had come down that lane at 6 in the morning, had come to a place that mattered in a different way than the palaces mattered. Those places were institutional. This was personal. And the guard knew it. At 6:22, the passenger door of the lead car opened. A woman got out. Dark coat, low heels, hair pulled back. She walked to the boot of the car and opened it, and I could see even from my distance that she was checking something. A bag. A document case, maybe. She removed something, tucked it under her arm, and closed the boot again. Then she walked to the rear door of the second car. The guard moved to intercept her. Not aggressively, not dramatically. He simply, and I mean this, stepped into her path, politely but completely, like a door that's been closed very quietly but is still very much a door. She stopped, said something. He responded. She said something again. I caught the tone that time, professional, unhurried, but with an edge of the schedule needs to happen, now that you recognize when you've ever worked anywhere with meetings and timings. The guard shook his head. Just once, slowly. And then, and this is the part that stayed with me all the way home on the train to London, the part I've thought about more times than I can count. He said something that, even from 30 feet away in the mist, I somehow heard. Maybe because everything else was so quiet. Maybe because I'd been straining to hear something, anything, for 20 minutes. He said clearly and quietly, "The princess is sleeping, ma'am. She gave word last night she wasn't to be woken before 7. I'm going to be honest with you. I've thought a lot about why that sentence hit me the way it did. I was standing on the grass in Windsor in my pajamas under a coat, watching a scene I had no business watching, and those 7 words made my throat go tight. Maybe it was the simplicity of it. In a world of titles and protocols and centuries of ceremony, it came down to something that basic. Someone was asleep, and she'd said she didn't want to be woken. And he was making that happen. Not because he was following a protocol exactly, or not only because of that, but because someone had asked, and he had listened, and he was holding that boundary with the same absolute steadiness he held everything else. The woman with the document case stood looking at him for a moment. Then she turned, went back to the lead car and got in. And the 2 cars sat in the lane. And the guard went back to his position. And the mist drifted. And somewhere above the tree line, the sky began, very slowly, to lighten toward a gray-pink that meant the sun was thinking about arriving. I stood on the grass until my feet got cold through my boots. Then I walked back to Sarah's flat. She was up when I got in, already making tea, still in her dressing gown, and she looked at me standing in the doorway with my boots muddy from the grass and asked what had happened. I didn't know how to explain it properly, still don't if I'm being honest. I just saw something, I said. Something bad. No, I took off my boots and sat down. Actually something kind of, I don't know, good, just quiet. Someone did something quietly good and I happened to see it. She poured me a cup and put it in front of me and didn't push for more, which is one of the things I've always loved about Sarah. I drank my tea. And outside, the sun finally arrived, burning the mist off the grass in long, slow ribbons. And somewhere not far away, in a cottage surrounded by trees, I imagine a princess slept on for another 38 minutes. Because someone had kept his word. His name was Daniel. I didn't learn that until much later, weeks later actually, in a way I'll get to, but for the purposes of telling this properly, I'm going to call him that now. Because he deserves a name. He deserves more than the guard I saw that morning, which is how I kept referring to him in my own head, and eventually to a few people I trusted enough to tell. Daniel. He was 24 years old. He'd been stationed at Windsor for 11 months. Before that, Buckingham Palace. Before that, training. Before that, a council estate in Sunderland where his mum worked nights at a supermarket and his older brother repaired motorcycles in the garage behind their house. I know these things because of what happened next. Because of how the story continued after that morning in the mist, which I didn't witness but which I later learned from a source I'm going to be careful about naming. Let's just say someone connected enough to know, and ordinary enough to tell me over a pint in a pub in Chiswick on a rainy Thursday in November. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back a few hours before I ever stepped onto that grass. It's 3 in the morning. The world is dark and cold and proper dark, not city dark, not London dark with its orange glow on the clouds, but Windsor dark, country dark, the kind of dark that has weight to it. Daniel has been on post since 11 p.m. He'll be relieved at 7. 8 hours. 8 hours of standing, of being still, of watching. Most people, when they imagine this, imagine it as a kind of emptiness, a blankness, a switching off. But it isn't. Anyone who's ever worked a long night shift of any kind knows that your mind doesn't switch off. It goes somewhere else. It finds its own level. Daniel's mind, on nights like this, did what it had always done since he was a boy, staying awake in the back seat of his mum's car on long drives up north to his aunt's. It noticed things. Small things. The way the light changed. The sound a fox made when it moved through the undergrowth and then stopped. The stopping was always the interesting bit, not the moving. The difference between a car that was slowing because it had reached its destination and one that was slowing because the driver had noticed something unexpected. He noticed, at 3:17 in the morning, a light in an upstairs window of the cottage. Not bright, not sudden. The particular kind of light that comes from a lamp, not an overhead fixture, turned on quietly, the way you turn on a lamp when someone else in the house is sleeping and you don't want to wake them. He'd seen lights in windows before. He'd been at this post long enough to understand the rhythms of the place, the patterns, which lights meant something and which lights meant a child had gotten up for a glass of water. This one he watched. It stayed on for a while, maybe 40 minutes, then went off. He filed it away in the part of his mind that kept the catalog. Every guard does this, builds up a picture of the place they're protecting, a live mental map that updates constantly. Most of what goes into the catalog is never relevant, but you keep it all anyway because you never know which piece will matter. At 4:40, he heard a phone call. He wasn't meant to hear it, and he barely did, just the low murmur of a voice from somewhere near the cottage. Not a phone going off. A call being received. Someone had been awake enough to have their phone on silent, have it vibrate, pick it up without a ringtone. At 5:15, a car arrived at the gate. Staff car, he knew the vehicle, waved it through. The driver stopped next to him and spoke briefly through the window. Something about a schedule adjustment. A morning appointment moved forward. Daniel listened, nodded, said he'd note it. He noted it. And at 5:45, a whole hour before I came wandering along in my pajamas, something else happened. A member of staff came out of the cottage. Not through the main door, the side entrance, the one that faced the garden. She came out with her coat half on, still buttoning it as she walked, which told Daniel she dressed quickly and hadn't expected to be outside at this hour. She came to him directly, which meant it was important. Staff didn't come to him for casual conversation at 5:45 in the morning. If someone came to him at that hour, they had a reason. She was young, maybe 22. One of the household staff, he knew her face, had exchanged maybe a dozen words with her over the months, none of them memorable. She looked, right then, like she was balancing several things at once and was slightly afraid of dropping one. "There's a visitor expected," she said. "We've had confirmation. Senior visitor. She'll be arriving around 5:30. Senior visitor. In the language of the household, senior visitor meant one thing. It meant someone of rank, not a friend, not family in the casual sense, someone for whom protocols applied. "What's the arrangement?" he asked. The girl hesitated. That hesitation told him everything. There wasn't one, or rather, the arrangement had been made on one end but not properly communicated to the other end, which happened more often than people might imagine in large organizations with many moving parts and a certain tendency toward assumption. The girl started, then stopped, tried again. "Her Royal Highness left word last night, before she went asleep. She said she wasn't to be disturbed before 7. Daniel looked at her. Did anyone inform the senior visitor's office of that? Another pause. I'm not certain. Right. Daniel took a slow breath, not a frustrated breath, a thinking breath. There's a difference. All right, he said. Go back inside. I'll handle the arrival. The girl looked relieved and guilty at the same time. The look of someone who has just passed a problem to someone else and feels both grateful and terrible about it. She pulled her coat the rest of the way on, nodded, and went back inside. Daniel stood in the cold and thought. This was, in some ways, the hardest part of the job. Not the standing still for 8 hours. Not the cold or the boredom or the way your back would ache if you let your posture slip for even a few minutes. The hard part was the moments that were never in the manual. The moments where two legitimate things were in conflict with each other, and someone had to decide which one held. The princess had left word. That was real. That was a direct instruction from the person whose household this was. A senior visitor, senior enough that this was being flagged to him in the dark at 5:45 in the morning, was on her way. That was real too. The schedule said one thing, the instruction said another. And somewhere in that cottage, someone was sleeping. He thought about his mum, staying up until 2 in the morning waiting for the bus home, sleeping with the curtains not quite meeting because she'd never gotten around to getting longer ones. The way she'd looked when he'd come in too loud one afternoon when she was on a day's sleep, the way she'd opened her eyes slowly, not with anger, just with that particular exhaustion that lives on the other side of night shifts. He thought about the light in the window at 3:17. Whoever was in that cottage had been awake in the small hours, awake long enough to turn on a lamp. For whatever reason, worry or work or just the kind of insomnia that comes with being someone whose life belongs partly to the public, even when you're in your own home. They deserved to sleep until 7. They'd said so themselves. And he was going to make sure they did. The cars arrived at 6:14. Daniel had positioned himself deliberately. Not blocking the lane, he wasn't there to make a scene or create a standoff. Just visible, clearly, unambiguously visible and clearly alert. The lead car stopped when the driver saw him step forward. He went to the passenger window. The man inside was senior security. He recognized the posture and the watchfulness, and he laid out the situation plainly. Senior visitor expected. Household instructions are no disturbance before 7. There may have been a communication gap on the scheduling end. He was awaiting guidance. The man looked at him for a moment, then picked up a phone. Daniel went back to his position. He wasn't anxious. That's what people don't understand about people who are good at this kind of thing. They're not fearless exactly. It's more that they've made their decision and the making of it settles them. He'd made his. He was holding it. Whatever came next came next. When the woman with the document case got out and walked toward the rear door of the second car, he moved. He was polite. He was very, very polite. He explained again. The princess is sleeping, ma'am. She gave word last night she wasn't to be woken before 7. The woman didn't argue with him, to her credit. She had the look of someone who was recalibrating quickly, doing the mental arithmetic of schedules and options. She went back to the car. She made a call. Daniel stood at his post. Now, here is where I have to tell you something about who was in that car. I didn't know at the time. How could I? I was standing on the grass in my pajamas. I could barely see the cars clearly through the mist, and nobody was announcing anything. But I found out later. I found out when I was having that pint in Chiswick on the rainy Thursday, and the person across from me, who I'll call Philippa, because she reminds me of a Philippa, and because she'd prefer not to be named specifically, said something that made me put down my glass. Philippa works in a capacity that I'll keep vague, in and around the kind of circles where names get passed and connections get made. She's not royal family. She's not household. But she knows people who know people in the way that certain Londoners do, the web of acquaintance and connection that runs through particular professions. That visit you're describing, she said, swirling her wine. The one at Adelaide Cottage in October. Yeah, that was Camilla. I looked at her. Her Majesty. I put down my glass. The Queen was in that car. Philippa tilted her head in that way she has. Not the Queen, no, but the Queen Consort. At the time, yes. Something to do with a morning schedule. A joint appearance that had been moved forward on the diary. Someone on the coordination side had made an assumption about the morning being available. She shrugged. These things happen. I sat there for a moment. I thought about the guard, Daniel standing in the mist. I thought about those two cars sitting in the lane for 4 minutes. I thought about him knocking on that rear window, quietly, respectfully, but clearly and without apology. The princess is sleeping, ma'am. She gave word last night she wasn't to be woken before 7. He had said that to Camilla, Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, wife of the king, one of the most senior members of the royal family. And she had listened. What happened then? I asked Philippa. I mean, what did she do after she heard that? Philippa looked at me with something that might have been amusement. What do you think she did? She waited. For how long? Until 7. I picked up my glass again. She just sat there in the car in the lane. For the better part of 45 minutes, yes. They had tea brought out from somewhere, I think. Her staff found a way. Philippa paused. Apparently she said it was completely reasonable, that she'd have wanted the same courtesy herself. I thought about that. About the specific quality of what that guard had done. Because it wasn't just that he'd stopped a car. It wasn't just that he'd held a position. He had, in some sense, extended to a sleeping woman something that often gets withheld from women in positions like hers. The simple right to her own rest. Her own time. Her own word. He hadn't bent to seniority. He hadn't bent to the document case, and the schedule, and the perfectly reasonable logic of a meeting that needed to happen. He'd held to the word of the person whose home this was. And the visitor had respected that. And I genuinely think, that moment meant something. That it was a small piece of something real. Something human in a world where everyone involved was also something considerably more than human in the public eye. Did he get in trouble? I asked. Philippa shook her head. Opposite. The story went up the chain. He handled it right. He communicated clearly, he was respectful, he held the instruction he'd been given. She looked at her wine. I heard it described as exactly the sort of thing they want from that post. Good, I said. Yes, she agreed, good. I've thought about Daniel a lot since then. About what it takes to be that person. To stand in the dark for 8 hours and then, in the 45th minute of your 8th hour, when you're tired and cold and a convoy of senior royal vehicles is idling in a lane 20 feet from you, to do the quiet, steady, entirely unglamorous thing. Not the dramatic thing, not the thing that makes a good headline. The thing that was right. Because that's actually the hardest kind of bravery, I think. Not the bravery that happens in a crisis, with adrenaline and the clarity that comes from danger. But the bravery of just doing your job, holding your line, saying a true thing to a powerful person, politely and clearly, and not moving until it's resolved. He was 24 years old. He grew up on a council estate in Sunderland. And on an October morning in Windsor, in the mist, before the world was awake, he stopped the Queen Consort's car and said, "She's sleeping." She asked not to be disturbed. And he meant it. And that was enough. I went back to Windsor once more after that, spring, late April, when the blossom is on the trees along the long walk and tourists are everywhere, and the whole place feels different, warmer, more permissive, alive in a way that October never quite manages. I walked along the path near Home Park again. Different light, different sounds, no mist. A completely different world from that October morning. I didn't see Daniel. Of course I didn't. Guards rotate, move, get posted elsewhere. He could have been anywhere by April. He could have been back at Buckingham Palace, or at Balmoral, or on leave, or at home in Sunderland visiting his mum. But I stopped, just for a moment, at the spot on the grass where I'd stood that morning. I knew it was approximately the right place because of the angle to the tree line and the direction of the lane. I stood there. A child ran past with a kite that was refusing to fly, trailing it behind her and laughing. A dog pulled at its lead. Two elderly men talked about something complicated involving a hedge. And I stood on the grass and thought, something happened here. Something that most people will never know about, and that didn't change the world in any large or measurable way. A woman slept until 7, because someone said she'd asked for that, and kept his word. There's a particular kind of story that never gets told. Not because it's secret, or not entirely because of that, but because it doesn't fit any of the categories we've decided stories need to fit. It's not scandalous. It's not triumphant. Nobody died and nobody got married and nobody made a speech that changed anything. It's just a true thing that happened between people, one quiet morning, and then it was over. Those are often the most important stories. I've been writing in some form or another for a long time, nothing famous, nothing you'd know, just the kind of writing you do because you can't stop doing it. Notebooks mostly. Observations. Things I've seen and heard that felt like they deserved to be written down even if nobody was ever going to read them. After that morning in Windsor, I went home and wrote 17 pages. Not about the guard exactly. Not about the cars or Camilla or Adelaide Cottage specifically. About what it means to hold a position. About what it means when someone says, "I don't want to be disturbed," and another person takes that seriously. About the particular loneliness of people who are never allowed to just be asleep. I want to take you somewhere else for a moment, not Windsor, not London. Sunderland. Because if we're going to tell this story properly, we have to go there first. Council estate. Not one of the bad ones that people write about in newspapers to make a point, just an ordinary one, the kind that exists all over the north of England and that looks, from the outside, like exactly what it is, a place where working people live. Red brick. Small gardens, some tended and some not. Cars with rust developing at the wheel arches. The smell of chip shops on Friday evenings. Daniel grew up in a house on the end of a row. 3 bedrooms. One of which was his older brother Marcus's and smelled permanently of engine oil, which their mum found infuriating and which Daniel, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, had always found comforting. His mum worked nights. I mentioned that already. What I didn't say is what she worked nights doing. She was a supervisor at a distribution center just outside the city. She'd worked her way up over 12 years from packing to shift leader, which sounds modest but wasn't. It meant being responsible for 40 people, for hitting targets, for solving problems at 2 in the morning when a conveyor breaks and the delivery window is closing. She was, by any measure, a competent and serious person who just happened to be doing it in a context that got no particular respect from anyone. Daniel watched her do this his entire childhood. He watched her come home at 6 a.m., make herself a cup of tea she was often too tired to finish, and fall asleep on the sofa because getting all the way upstairs felt like too much. He watched her set 3 alarms because she was always afraid of sleeping through them. He watched her navigate the particular indignity of a life that runs on the opposite schedule from the world, trying to sleep while the bin collection happened, while the neighbors' kids came home from school, while the whole street carried on with its afternoon life outside her window. She never complained about it. That's not the kind of person she was. But he saw it. He saw what it cost her. He saw what sleep meant to someone who never quite got enough of it. When he joined the army at 18, not because he had a burning childhood dream of service, but because it was the most available door that led anywhere, and he'd always been the kind of person who needed structure. He was good at the physical demands almost immediately. The training, the discipline, the early mornings. All of it felt familiar in the way that challenge only feels familiar when you've been watching someone handle hard things your whole life. But what made him stand out, what eventually got him noticed and considered for guard duty at the royal residences, which is not something that happens to everyone, which is in fact a competitive and selective process, was something one of his training officers noted in his report. Exceptional situational awareness, understands the difference between a rule and a reason. That line. I've thought about that line. Because it's rare. Most people, when given a rule, either follow it mechanically, because it's there, because it was told to them, because it's easier than thinking, or they find reasons to bend it. Both of those are, in their way, kinds of laziness. Understanding the difference between a rule and a reason is harder. It means understanding why the rule exists, what it's protecting, and then applying that protection even in situations the rule didn't specifically anticipate. The rule was, guard the residence, keep it safe. The reason was, the people inside deserve to feel safe, to have their space protected, to have their word respected. Nobody had written in any manual, if the Queen Consort arrives unannounced before the scheduled time, and the Princess of Wales has left word not to be disturbed, you should stop the car and explain the situation calmly and stand your ground for 45 minutes. That wasn't in any manual. But Daniel understood the reason, and the reason told him what to do. After Philippa told me who was in the car, I went home and sat with it for a while. I'm not going to pretend I found it easy to get my head around, because there's something almost absurd about it when you say it directly. A young man from a council estate in Sunderland stopped a Queen Consort's motorcade and made her wait in a lane for 3/4 of an hour because someone was sleeping and had asked not to be woken. But the more I sat with it, the less absurd it seemed. Because what is monarchy at its most fundamental? What is the whole point of the institution, underneath all the ceremony and history and debate about its costs and its relevance, if not this? The idea that there are people who hold certain things in trust, that they hold them carefully, and that the people around them take that seriously. And when you strip away all the trappings, what Daniel did that morning was hold something in trust. He was trusted with the knowledge that someone had asked for something small and human, sleep, just sleep, until a particular hour, and he kept that trust. Against pressure, against inconvenience, against the perfectly understandable logic of a schedule. He kept it. I want to tell you about what happened at 7 o'clock. This part I know less precisely. It's reconstructed from fragments, from Philippa, and from a couple of other things I've since heard from people who exist in the outer rings of the orbit of these events. I'm being careful to frame it as what I believe happened rather than what I know for certain, because I'm not a journalist, and I'm not trying to present this as reportage. I'm just trying to tell the story as close to true as I can get it. At 7 o'clock, or very close to it, a member of household staff came out of Adelaide Cottage. She crossed to the lane where the cars were still waiting. They had not left. They had simply waited, tea having been brought out at some point as Philippa mentioned, and she spoke to the guard. He led her through to the cars. There was a brief conversation, and then the car doors opened, and the visit that had been paused in the mist for 45 minutes resumed. I'm told, and again, I hold this loosely, that when Camilla got out of the car, she said something to the guard as she passed him. Not a long thing, brief. Something along the lines of, "You did the right thing." 4 words, maybe 5. Said quietly, not for anyone else, not for an audience, just said. And Daniel, who had stood in the cold and the mist for the better part of 8 hours, and who would not be relieved for another few minutes yet, straightened slightly and nodded and said nothing. Because that is also part of the job. You do the right thing, and sometimes you're told you did, and you accept it with exactly the same stillness with which you accepted everything else. I've been asked, since I first started telling this story quietly to people I trusted, why it matters, why I keep thinking about it, why 17 pages in a notebook and now this. And I understand the question. In the scheme of things, of everything happening in the world, of the large and grinding wheels of history, a guard stopping a car in a misty lane in Windsor is not, objectively, a significant event. But I think that's actually why it matters. The significant events get covered. They get written about, argued about, analyzed. The cameras are there. The words are recorded. Historians will argue about them for generations. The small events, the moments of quiet, steady, unglamorous righteousness, those disappear. They happen and then they're over and the world moves on, and most of the time nobody knows. And I think we need to know about them. Not because they're more important than the big events, but because they're the texture of things. They're what a society is actually made of, underneath the events. The individual decisions made in individual moments by individual people who will never be famous for making them. Daniel is not famous. He will not be famous. His name will not be in any history book. He stood in the cold for 8 hours and did one specific, quiet thing exactly right, and that is everything and nothing. Except, somewhere there is a person who slept until 7, who woke up when she was ready, who came to her morning on her own terms, because someone had held that for her. And even if she never thinks about it, even if that morning is, to her, just one of 10,000 mornings that blur together in the way that days blur when you live at the pace that these lives require, it was real. It was real, and it mattered, and it happened. I finished those 17 pages a few days after I got back from Windsor. Then I closed the notebook and put it on the shelf and went back to my ordinary life. My flat in Stockwell, my job, my cat who is old and grumpy and doesn't care about anything that happens outside a 10-foot radius of his food bowl. Weeks passed. Then Philippa told me who was in the car, and I opened the notebook again. I read back through everything I'd written. And on the last page, I added one more line. I've thought a lot about whether to share it. It feels slightly too neat, too like a proper ending, for something that in real life has no proper ending at all. But here it is. We spend so much time asking whether the powerful respect each other. We almost never ask whether they can be made, quietly, to respect the rest of us. This morning they were. That's it, really. That's the whole thing. A guard named Daniel, a lane in Windsor, a car that stopped, 4 minutes of mist and wood pigeons and cold. And someone who got to sleep until 7. I want to end by telling you something that happened on the train back to London. Not something dramatic, just something small and true. I was sitting in the window seat on the 8:42 from Windsor and Eton Riverside, still in my coat, my boots still a bit muddy from the grass, and I was staring out at the Berkshire countryside going past. The fields, the trees, the motorway overpass, all of it ordinary and beautiful in the way that ordinary things sometimes are when you've just seen something that's made you pay attention. And an older woman sat down across from me, gray coat, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, one of those compact umbrellas that collapses to nothing, tucked into her bag. She looked at me for a moment, not rudely, just the way strangers sometimes do when they sit down, a brief acknowledgement of shared space, and then she took out a book. We didn't speak for the whole journey. But as the train pulled into Waterloo and everyone started gathering their things, she caught my eye again and said, in a perfectly conversational voice, as if we'd been talking all along, "You look like someone who's just remembered something important." I laughed a little startled. "Is it that obvious?" She shrugged, only slightly. She put her book in her bag and stood and was gone into the crowd at the platform, and I never saw her again. But she wasn't wrong. I had remembered something important. Not something I'd forgotten exactly, something I'd maybe stopped believing in. That the small things matter. That someone keeping their word in the dark and the cold, to someone who will never know they kept it, that matters. That the world is also made of that. The mist was gone by the time I reached London. It was a bright morning by then. Clean autumn light on the Thames as the cab went over the bridge. Tourists and business people and cyclists and everyone going somewhere. And somewhere behind me, 40 miles west, a woman had slept until 7. And a young man from Sunderland had made sure of it. And the world kept turning. And that was enough.